Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Perspective. And once again, delighted to be in your company. We are going to be unpacking something very important today. We'll be talking about ADHD and the health professionals that are involved in this type of therapy. So we will be talking with an occupational therapist, something I was not aware of. I never ever connected OTs doing therapy for children, tweens, teens, adults, in people who present with ADD and ADHD. So I'm really delighted to be covering the subject today with an OT. Her name is Tasneem Abrahams, and she comes with a wealth of experience and information. So sit back, and this is truly a journey of understanding, learning, and really assisting and supporting your loved one who might be suffering from ADD or ADHD. Tasneem Abrahams is an occupational therapist in private practice, and she, of course, provides support and therapy and also coaching skills to adults, tweens, and teens who struggle with executive functioning and emotional and sensory regulation affecting their daily functioning. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam, and shukran so much for having me on the show.
Welcome, welcome. I'm so thrilled that we have you here because I've just realized in our off-air discussions about the medical professionals who support people with this condition, ADD and ADHD. I was never aware of this in the past, and I'm glad that I am talking with you so that people understand if they suspect that their little one or their teens, or they themselves for that matter, have this condition, to really, for you know, to go to an OT as their first port of call. Would that be correct?
So a lot of the people that come to OT do have a misconception about what our profession is. It's in our name. Occupation for us is anything that occupies your time. So if there's anything that you need to, want to, or are required to do that you are struggling with for whatever reason, that may be a physical, mental health issue, an occupational therapist is the right point of call. So I wanted to also just, differentiate between those who are diagnosed and who are not diagnosed. And this is a key element to bring up because we are seeing an increase in late diagnosed adults. And, you know, there's always that, hesitation where people say, oh, you know, everybody has ADHD these days. We didn't have this problem in our day. But I want to say it's in the same way back in the day when my mom always tells a story where she was left-handed. There were no left-handed because we were forced to write with our right hand. Doesn't mean that left-handedness didn't exist. In the same way, just because ADHD wasn't a common diagnosis back then doesn't mean it didn't exist. What has happened is that the research and the understanding of the human brain has increased. And now what we're seeing is because of social media and people having access to education about what ADHD is, more and more people are seeing the signs and then seeking out the diagnosis. What also happens is that because ADHD is a genetic hereditary brain neurotype, what happens is that often if the child has ADHD, it is a very high chance that one of the parents has ADHD. And so oftentimes when you take your child for an ADHD diagnosis, through the process of the diagnostic process, you actually recognize in yourself that, hang on, this sounds like me. This is what I was like as a child. This is what I'm currently struggling with. So what happens is people sometimes suspect they have ADHD and then they seek out diagnosis, but it's very difficult to get an appointment with somebody who is a specialist in diagnosis. As occupational therapist,
you here. I indicated in the introduction that an OT would be your first port of call. But what I'm hearing you say is that one needs to first be diagnosed by another healthcare professional before you go to an OT for therapy. Who would that healthcare professional be?
Yes, so that's where I was getting to, in that it's not necessarily so. So what happens is if somebody suspects they might have ADHD and they want a diagnosis, as a first-line practitioner, occupational therapists can identify the signs and symptoms as a sort of a screen and refer on to an appropriate professional. There are lots of health professionals out there who will just willy-nilly dish out a diagnosis. And I want to just say that it's important that the diagnostic process is very rigorous. You can't just have somebody give you a form to fill out and you tick some boxes and then they say, okay, now you have ADHD. There are very specific criteria that needs to be met. One, there are 18 signs and symptoms. As an adult, you need to meet at least 5 of the 18 signs and symptoms across both inattentive symptoms and hyperactivity symptoms. But the signs and symptoms need to be present for more than 6 months consecutively before the age of 12, and it needs to affect more than 2 or more functional areas in your life. So it can't be that you're only struggling with these things in work, but everything else you don't struggle with, time management, etc. It has to happen in more than 2 functional areas. As an occupational therapist, our key scope is around function. We are the experts in identifying tasks, what the analysis of a task is, what your functional capacities, etc. So we often are the ones who can pick up and refer appropriately. So I do want to appeal to people, if they do feel they want a diagnosis, don't just go to anyone. Go to either a psychiatrist or developmental pediatrician or a clinical psychologist who actually has, in their history, you can see they have a special interest and a special focus and experience in ADHD and do a robust diagnosis and are not just going to do one interview and say that you have it. But as an OT, we can address the signs and symptoms. So even without a diagnosis, if you are struggling and you haven't got a diagnosis yet, because the waiting lists are often quite long, you can already go to an OT. Because what we do is focus more on the functional aspect and the practical implementations of tools and strategies to help you get to do the things you need to, want to, or expected to do.
Okay, so let me ask you this question. You would then support the child, the teen, or even an adult to address how they manage their day-to-day life. You also mentioned a psychiatrist or a clinical psychologist. What about people who prefer not to go that route and just come directly to the OT? I'm kind of wondering if they get referred to perhaps a psychiatrist, would that indicate that perhaps medication is also involved in their therapy?
Yes, and that's an excellent question. I'm glad you asked that, because I get that question a lot from people who come to me who haven't had a diagnosis yet. And I always say to people, there are only 3 reasons to get an official diagnosis. The first reason is you just want to know. Some people, a lot of people say, once they get a diagnosis of depression or autism or ADHD, whatever that may be, some people see it as a label, and other people, they just feel like, oh, that just makes me feel like there's nothing wrong with me. There's actually this official explanation of the struggles I'm having. If that will help you on your healing journey, then go for a diagnosis. If you don't need to know what it is that you're struggling with, you just want to, fix this thing that you're struggling with. You don't really care what it's called, but you do feel that you would like to explore medication and pharmacology. You have to have a diagnosis from an official medical professional who is a prescribing practitioner, and that would be your psychiatrist or your developmental pediatrician. And the third reason is if you need reasonable accommodations. So whether you're at school and you need concessions because you struggle with exams, you need extra time, you need a separate venue, any of those things, or whether you are in the workplace, and I work with a lot of adults who are going through performance reviews, etc. And part of my job is to help assist identify reasonable accommodations in the workplace. But for both of those things, you need an official diagnosis. They're not going to accept a report from an OT without a backup from a doctor or who confirms that you have a diagnosis of ADHD or whatever it may be. And if none of those 3 reasons fit you, then you don't need a diagnosis. You just need to go to somebody to help you live your best life.
Oh, great stuff. So you mentioned something else that piqued my interest, and you spoke about reasonable accommodation in school or in the workplace, and I'm wondering, very especially in school, is the education system geared up enough to support those children? And I just think that if they're not, and I suspect very strongly they're not, those poor kids do fall through the cracks, don't they, if they don't have the correct support in place?
Absolutely. So, of course, we have now an education system that's very broad. Mainstream government education is not adequately equipped to deal with reasonable accommodation. One, because of class sizes, lack of resources, not enough educators. But it really varies from school to school. I've been to a school, met with a teacher, and explained some of the reasonable accommodation a child has had. But the nature of the school is so big. They have over 1,000 kids. The class sizes are big. It's not always, and educators aren't always, informed enough about how they can implement reasonable accommodations without impacting their workload. They're also stressed. They have a lot of burnout, etc. But you do get a lot of cottage schools or learning hubs, which now, where it is indicated, if a child will do better in that kind of environment, can do a world of good. Because we do have, since COVID now, there's a lot more online schools, etc. And some children can't work online independently, but they can join like a cottage school or a learning hub where they can do their online curriculum, but within a classroom environment. So there are options available, but not enough, unfortunately. So you're absolutely right. Schools aren't fully equipped to provide those reasonable accommodations.
And unfortunately, the same can be said for workplaces as well. But be that as it may, we need to also understand, and you can respond to me after the ad break, this next question. The difference between ADD and ADHD and how it impacts on the children and adults as well. And if you have been diagnosed with these conditions, and perhaps you're an adult by now, and you recognize that I suffer from one of those, what sort of a life are we looking at? Bearing in mind that you've never had any treatment. As an adult, you have more control over your situation. Can you live a relatively normal life without any additional support? But all of that and more after the ad break. My guest is Tasneem Abrahams, an occupational therapist, discussing something really interesting and important for us as a community. We're talking ADD and ADHD, the type of obviously support you need to get once you've been diagnosed. And if you're an adult and you recognize what we cover as perhaps signs and symptoms regarding this condition, maybe you're one of those lucky ones that would be able to navigate through life without any support. But all of that and much, much more right after the break. Welcome back. This is Perspective with me, Julie Ali, and my guest is the lovely Tasneem Abrahams. She's an occupational therapist, and on the show today, we are talking ADD and ADHD. She also uses strength-based, client-centered, and evidence-based approach to therapy and coaching for teens and adults with ADHD, and we're going to focus on that a little later on in the program. But for now, let's understand what's the difference between ADD and ADHD, and is the same type of therapy used in both these conditions? Welcome.
Thank you so much for that question. I'm glad you asked it because it's a really important one. A lot of even health professionals aren't keeping up to date with the changes in the diagnosis. So just to give some background, as health professionals, we use what is called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual to make diagnosis, where it outlines exactly what the features are of each diagnosis. And we are currently on version 5. So over time, as they get to know more about the condition, they might change the diagnostic criteria, etc. So it used to be that there was a distinction between ADD and ADHD. Then it became ADD/HD. Now it's done away with completely. There is only one diagnosis, which is ADHD. And instead of having a separation between the two, so one being attention deficit disorder, the other one being attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Now there's only ADHD, but with 3 presentation types. So what that means is that you can either have an inattentive type ADHD, a hyperactive type ADHD, or a combined type ADHD. Another thing to recognize is that these are not just subtypes where you have one and that's the one you have the rest of your life. Recent research, and there's a very famous psychologist called Dr. Russell Barkley, who does a lot of talks on this, where he says it's a presentation type which means it can change over time. So you can, initially be diagnosed with a hyperactive presentation, but through life's changes, you develop a combined type where you develop inattentive signs and symptoms as well. And so that's a very important thing to recognize. And I want to say on that point, we mentioned about diagnosis and late diagnosis. A very important information I want to get across is that a large percentage of late diagnosed adults are women. And the reason being is that a lot of the research, and research is done on like large populations, and that a lot of the research was always done on boys, small boys. So a lot of the diagnostic criteria is molded on the presentation as it appears in boys. But we know that oftentimes we see now that a lot of girls are missed for a diagnosis of ADHD when they are children because of various factors, and some of the reasons is from societal expectations of what is acceptable for a girl. So if you have a girl who is really quiet and presents with inattentive symptoms, it is often goes under the radar because it's acceptable for a girl to be quiet.
You've said something really important, and I think we need to be educated on that point. Are you saying that a reserved child can also present with ADD or ADHD, as it's now known as, and because boys are it's societal norms to accept that boys are very boisterous. So in that respect, parents would miss the fact that that child has got ADHD. And with this reserved little girl, she may have the condition, but because she's reserved, it won't present. So when will it present, and how will it impact on her because she doesn't, it's missed and there's no support in place for her?
Yeah. So I think the key thing to recognize is that ADHD is not it's not an illness. So, when you acquire major depressive disorder, that is an illness that can be treated through medication, psychotherapy, etc. What's really important to recognize is that ADHD is a neurodivergent brain type. What does that mean? Neuro means brain, and diverse means different. So we are all neurodiverse. Between you and I, our brains are not the same. So we are neurodiverse, but we are not all neurodivergent, meaning we haven't diverged away from the norm. Yeah, we on the other side, we're not on the other side of the bell curves. So there's this umbrella called neurodiversity, and under that there are various neurodivergent conditions: ADHD, autism, dyslexia, dyscalculia, even OCD is now categorized under the neurodivergence umbrella. And because it's a brain type, it just means that the way this person's brain operates is different to a typical society, and the society is built for a neurotypical brain type. And so what happens is that it's not an intelligence, it's not a sign of intelligence. You get many people with ADHD who are all along the spectrum of intelligence, just like as anybody else. Hyper intelligent and those who have learning disability, but it's not because of the ADHD. So what often happens with children is if they are academically performing average to well, then they're not going to be picked up, because what's key to understand is disability or conditions are only a problem when it affects other people. So you are dysfunctioning in society when you are not able to fit into what society expects of you, and it affects them.
So a child or an adult who is hyperactive obviously is going to affect us because they're very disruptive.
Yes.
They don't complete tasks.
Yes.
And they're draining. When you're in their space, they drain you. And people then avoid them. And would I be correct in saying that perhaps they then end up being the misfits in society simply because of their condition? And like you said, it's not a disease, it's a condition. And with the right therapy, could they get to a place of acceptance and normalization?
Absolutely. So the key thing there is around context. Context is everything. If you take somebody who is in a job that requires them to have loads of energy constantly, like let's say you take somebody who's in a sales role and they have to like jump about and talk to everybody and etc. That person wouldn't be picked up as somebody who has hyper energy. But if you take that same person and you put them in an environment where they need to be quiet, they need to be still, they need to give other people a chance to speak, and they're constantly interrupting, etc., and they can't contain that, then it's a problem. So context is everything. But what I want to point out is that I mentioned before that the diagnostic criteria is the signs and symptoms are all executive functions. So if you understand your brain, so a common way that we explain this to children is if you take your fist like this, and this is your brain and your brain stem. The front part is your frontal cortex. Mm-hmm. That is your executive brain. And executive means your brain tells you how to execute tasks, right? And the rest of that's only 20% of your brain. The other 80% is your limbic system, how you think, how you feel, how you know you're hungry, how you know you're thirsty, your fear, all of those things. Only 20% of your brain actually directs your activity. And these are things like time management, task initiation, attention and focus, goal-directed persistence, emotional regulation, etc. So what I want to just emphasize is that all of us struggle with one or two, some aspect of executive functioning. All of us have problems with procrastination sometimes, or with being late sometimes, or with, not regulating our emotions sometimes. So every single person who is diagnosed with ADHD has executive dysfunction, but not everyone who has executive dysfunction has ADHD. And the key distinction is how pervasive is that impact in this person's life, and how does it impact their functioning. And why girls or even boys who are missed often is because they are performing well academically, they participate in a lot of sports, and they go under the radar because they are not causing problems for their parents and the people around them. But internally, they are really struggling. And it's only when there's through these transitional periods where their context changes that suddenly now they notice. If you think about, and ironically, children who live in a very supportive household where the parents support their executive functions, they are often missed. Because if you think about it, your child doesn't have to remember their homework because your parents gets all the emails and makes sure you does it and tells you when to, reminds you to bring your stuff. And suddenly you go to university or live in res and you have to know when to buy groceries, know when to pay bills. Suddenly you struggle because you didn't develop those executive functions or because you have an underlying diagnosis of ADHD.
Okay, we're going for a break in literally a minute, so a short answer to the next question. If you're diagnosed later on in life, when you reach varsity or in a marriage, is it too late to get the necessary therapy for you to start functioning in a more acceptable and normal way? Yes or no?
No, definitely it's not too late.
Oh, great.
It's never
stuff.
too late.
Okay, let's go for our ad break. When we get back, lots more to unpack with our OT, and that, of course, is you, Tasneem Abrahams. Welcome back. We're talking ADHD with an occupational therapist, Tasneem Abrahams. She's also on the board of directors for Josie for Autism, and she strives to be a neurodiversity ally, something she touched on just a little while ago for us to understand what neurodivergent means. She gave us a beautiful explanation on that. And she also works hard at promoting the voices of neurodivergent individuals with lived experience of autism and ADHD. She uses her platforms to provide education, awareness and support. So back to her on ADHD right here on Perspective. You've shared so much of information in the past while with us, and I'm just beginning to understand more how important it is for parents, teachers, and society in general to be aware and to monitor their children, because if they miss it, you could end up with a child who feels and does become a total misfit. So how important are issues like diet, stigma? How does this impact on the person? And more importantly, when a child is in the early years of adolescence, and because they're ADHD and nobody's picked it up, they are marginalized. And then they go through life ending up being misfits in society simply because they misunderstood. Nobody, not even the parents, tried to get them the necessary support. And here they are, their life meaning absolutely nothing. Where and how do we then support this person? And very importantly, diet and stigma, how this impacts on them even further.
So I like to say that I take what is called a whole brain body systems approach. So what I mean by that, I mentioned already the whole brain. It's the frontal and the other 80% of the brain. And the body also plays a big part. But there's a lot of literature around diet and how that affects neurodivergence, etc. But the thing is, we all benefit from a good diet. It affects all of us. If you have a bad diet, it affects your ability to concentrate if you don't drink enough water, if you have too much sugar, etc. So it's not really specifically about the causation or correlation between what you eat and ADHD. It's your diet, how it affects you, anybody, whether you have ADHD or not. So absolutely, diet is important. We do have to look at what some foods are stimulants, and if you are a hyperactive presentation of ADHD, of course you don't want to give somebody who's already hyper energetic stimulant type foods. And if you are inattentive, you want to give them don't want to give them foods that are going to reduce their energy levels. So obviously that is important, but the system is also important. So what is the context and environment that supports this person? What are the changes in the context and environment that needs to be made? And stigma is a really big part of that. And I want to say, particularly in our communities, there is a lot of stigma around mental health. A lot of late diagnosed ADHD adults are initially diagnosed with anxiety and depression, especially women. So the initial diagnosis is anxiety and depression. It's not to say they don't have anxiety and depression. Anxiety and depression often comes afterwards as a result of the constant masking and feeling bad about oneself and stressing because I can't do anything, etc. And because of the ADHD being the underlying reason they're struggling, then anxiety and depression comes on later in life. So we have to look at the person holistically and understand what is it that supports that they need. So from an OT perspective, there are 3 different strategies we look at, right? We look at what is the misalignment between what this person has from a physiological, cognitive, social, communication aspect, the whole person, the whole brain body, and what is required from them in terms of the activities that they need to do in the environments they need to do them. So we look at the requirements of the activity and then what this person has and what the mismatches are. Once we identify the mismatches, we can address those in 3 different ways. Either through partners, so you have somebody who can support you. So often in ADHD, we talk about accountability buddies or people who hold you accountable. You study with somebody who you know is going to hold you accountable to sit and focus for a period of time. Or you have tools, and tools can be technology. We have like your alarms, you have calendars, all of those kinds of things, or it's environmental modifications. So as a sensory-based OT, we often do like a sensory profile to establish what your thresholds are. So if you are somebody who is highly sensitive to sound, of course you're going to struggle to concentrate in an environment where you are constantly distracted by many sounds. So maybe we need to introduce a quieter environment or a tool like noise cancelling headphones when you need to do deep focus activity, as opposed to when you need to do very interactive social activity and you thrive on kind of auditory stimulation. then maybe that's the type of learning you need to be involved in. So it's really important to look at each individual's unique needs in terms of how do they need to participate in society and what strategies can they employ, or is it a skill that they need to learn? So if you have poor working memory, are there cognitive games you can play that can improve your working memory? So we have to look at like, why is this person struggling to do the thing that they really want to do, and how can we, cover that mismatch?
Tasneem, underlying all of this is the important question. Of course, these children, there's a lot of stigma attached to the condition. The child is labeled as naughty, and I should imagine this is the child that's very, very fidgety as well. They have a lot of energy, so this is not a child or a person that's going to sit still and quietly for a half an hour or longer. So the partners or the parents have to be working very closely with the OT to help this child overcome. And is that the correct terminology when I say overcome? Do they get better over time, or does this indicate that for the rest of their lives, these are the strategies that they're going to need to rely on for them to obviously behave in a normal environment around normal supposed people? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I think the thing is that you have to, we as human beings, we develop over time. So again, it's about your context and environment. So the environment changes over time, what is required of you changes over time, your responsibilities changes over time. And it's very individual to each person. As you grow up, what the things you need and want to do will change. Your personality, your dreams, your hopes, your aspirations will change. Some people will struggle for a very long time if the adaptations that they're experiencing in their life, they aren't able to find strategies. It's not to say that if you implement a strategy as a child, that you're going to have to use that for the rest of your life. Because as you get older, your presentation changes, you mature, etc. You learn skills. It's important to remember that executive functioning skills develops way well into your 20s, up until the age of 26 or something. And it's always interesting to me as adults, and I mean, I'm guilty of this as well with my own children. As adults, we ourselves struggle to regulate ourselves. We struggle to regulate when we are tired, when we are hungry, when we are stressed, overwhelmed, etc. Yet we expect a child who doesn't have the emotional capacity or the communication capacity to describe what they're feeling or even understand it. We say you shouldn't throw a tantrum, but how many adults throw tantrums? It just doesn't look the same. A child might throw a tantrum by throwing themselves on the floor and screaming and shouting, and some man who has road rage, who can't regulate himself, his version of a tantrum is that he gets out and screams at the next person and maybe beats them up. We also throw tantrums.
Are those the adults that have ADHD?
It's not necessarily, but I think what I'm getting at is at the core of it, it's about learning the skills to regulate yourself.
Absolutely.
If you are being disruptive in society. And when I say I'm a neurodiversity ally, there's this move towards being less medical model and being what we call neurodiversity affirming practice. It's affirming the person's experience, and it's not about, there is no normal in today's society. We are such a diverse human race, right? It's about how do you function in a way that feels good and that everybody can benefit from. If you are a little bit quirky and it doesn't bother anybody, so what? As long as you feel confident and comfortable and your wellness is really at the core of it. And there are many individuals who live thriving, successful lives with their ADHD because they have those supports in place.
Another important question, what about people who perceive, and you can correct me because I know the word mental health came up a couple of times in your responses to my questions. People suffering from ADHD, if left untreated, later on in life, is there a risk for them developing some form of mental health issues? And what would they look like? And I know you're going to say it's so different from person to person. It would depend on the personality type, the background, life experience. the current situation they're in. So all of that's going to play a huge role. But before you do respond to that, you're not going to believe it, time for our next ad break. And when we get back, we're going to be into the final 12 minutes of the show. So do stay with us. Time flies when you have a very interesting guest or when you're having lots of fun. So on the show today, I'm not only having fun, but learning a lot from our guest, and that, of course, is Tasneem Abrahams, an occupational therapist. And she's taken us to places that I didn't even dream was possible as being part of this condition, ADHD, if left untreated. Before the ad break, I put in a question to her regarding mental health issues if people are left untreated. But before we get there, I also wanted to share something else with you about my guest, Tasneem. She's passionate about developing the mindset and business skills of health professionals and other coaches in the wellness space through her business, the Private Practice Growth Club. So let's look at the issue around mental health issues and ADHD, and then we're going to talk about her Private Practice Growth Club. Back to you. Fascinating lady with an amazing box of tools and talents. So this hour clearly is not enough in unpacking everything you do have to share with us. So I do invite you to join me at a later date on another program, but for now, let's look at the issue around mental health and ADHD.
So as I alluded to earlier, a lot of the people I see also initially had a diagnosis of ADHD, anxiety or depression. There is a very high comorbidity rate of people with ADHD having anxiety or depression later on in life. And often that is linked to not having developed the coping skills to manage those mismatches I spoke about. And so because you're struggling to do the things you need to do or fulfill your roles, that can often lead to an onset of depression, or because you struggle to get things done or be on time, there's that constant anxiety. It's quite ironic. A lot of my adult ADHD clients, they struggle with time management, and as a result, they are always early for appointments, not late, because they've got so much anxiety around the fact that they are going to be late, because they know they're so bad with managing their time that, and there's this thing, you'll see on social media, there's always that, those funny posts with people who have lived experience where they will talk about how, I have an appointment at 3 o'clock, and as a result, I can't do anything the whole morning because that constant anxiety that I have this thing at 3 o'clock. So like I can't start anything because what if I don't finish? What if I am late? And then they waste a whole day.
And the pressure on them.
Exactly. So it is really important to get the help even when you are not struggling in full-on mode, because over time, if you don't, the help is really about giving you the strategies and empowering you with a level of choice and self-reliance. I often talk within my clients, we have like this initial assessment where we look at this ladder of this journey of change, from feeling stuck to feeling empowered. And feeling stuck is where you don't have insight that you are struggling, you don't really think you need help. And it moves up the ladder where you get to a point where you're trying out different things, trial and error, seeing what works for you, what doesn't work, all the way to a point where it's not to say that you're never going to struggle. We all have struggles. That is the nature of life. But that you get to a point that when struggles do come about, that you know yourself, you have self-awareness, you know what skills you need or require, and you have strategies to get you through it. That's really what health is all about. It's getting through difficult times.
Early on, I spoke about stigma. I think apart from society stigmatizing the person and the condition of ADHD, the person, him or herself, feel helpless and hopeless. And that is why it's all important that they get diagnosed and they get the necessary help. Because the stigma of, I'm not okay, I'm mentally not well, and people are going to avoid me and marginalize me. So their self-image and self-worth is very, very poor. And they're not going to be able to get far in life if they carry this with them. And then also the issue around the fact that they're carrying all of this baggage with them. I'm thinking about when they were little and they went for therapy. Back in the day, and I'm not quite sure if it is still extant at the moment, is children, little children that were diagnosed with ADHD, hyperactive, were medicated with Ritalin. And people are saying, lots of people are saying that the Ritalin probably created a dependency on other medications later on in life, possibly addictions. What are your thoughts on those?
So I think that it's very difficult what people need to understand, there's lots of research that talks about correlation, but correlation does not mean causation. So what do I mean by that? We could say that every time you wear a yellow scarf, there's a bird in the studio. There's a correlation in that happening often at the same time. It doesn't mean that because you wear a yellow scarf, that is why the bird came into the studio. And this is the battle we have with, on the one hand, social media is good for spreading awareness and information, but on the other hand, it's also a tool for spreading misinformation, misunderstanding, because the layperson doesn't necessarily know how to understand and read into research and understand, the veracity of it and validity, etc. So why I'm saying that is that there are cases, of course, where, and I'm not pro or for or against medication. My view is that it's the person's choice. If you want to take the medication route, by all means take the medication route. I will support you as your therapist. If you are totally against medication, even if you think it's going to help you and for whatever your reasons are, by all means there are other ways. The key thing isn't whether you take medication or not and whether you develop a dependency or not. The key thing is that Ritalin helping that child to concentrate long enough for them to be able to just complete a task? Why are you taking that away from them?
And that would be the litmus test.
Yes.
By the parent and the teacher.
Yeah, it's like saying to somebody, well, if you have an Achilles problem, you're going to develop a dependency on the crutch. And then, but it makes the person be able to walk with less pain. Why are you taking the crutch away? It's the same thing.
Okay.
But again, it's that person's choice. If they don't want to take the pharmacology route, that's their choice. But I just want to point out that the key thing is, I was telling you this like when we were off air, is that we are a member state of the World Health Organization. And the World Health Organization has developed a more holistic definition of health. We still operate in a very medical model, especially in South Africa. It's all about the body structures and functions. You fix this, you provide a medication, you fix the chemistry in the brain, etc. But the World Health Organization definition talks about body functions and structures, but also activities, participation within a context of environment, and takes into account your personal factors, like your religion, your culture, etc. Right? And when you look at that broad definition of health, this is why occupational therapists need to be included in more intervention, in more core interventions, because it is core to our scope of practice, is about helping people improve their ability to perform activities and participate in society within the environment that they need to participate in. So part of the World Health Organization directive is that all member states need to adopt what they call the International Classification of Functioning. And within that, you even have codes for, daily living, shopping, going to work, etc. And these are all things occupational therapists are involved in.
So what you're really saying is that when you look at ADHD or any other condition for that matter, it is on a spectrum. No two patients, no two children or no two adults will present in exactly the same way. So it's really dependent on your diagnosis and the type of support you and perhaps the psychiatrist or the clinical psychologist would suggest. So here again, like other diseases and other conditions, almost a multidisciplinary approach is required in assisting the patient.
Absolutely. And, psychologists play such an important part in that thinking part of the brain because it is a talking therapy. So you address how your thoughts affect your feelings, which affects your behaviors. And obviously educational psychologists also do deal with a lot of learning skills and cognitive skills. But what the occupational therapist brings to the table is more the practical aspects. So, for example, I might have a client who struggles with managing their time, their day-to-day. They struggle with task initiation, so that's what we call procrastination. They're often putting things off. A psychologist might dive deep into the, what's causing the fears and the things that's stopping them from doing the task. And OT might say, okay, let's break down this task. Let's look at what it is you need to do. Let's break down the task. Let's create a system or a system that you can follow. And you can apply what you learned in psychology in terms of psychological tools while using the system. It's not uncommon for me to sit with a client with a computer with a Google Calendar, or to sit with a planner, or to create a custom planner, or to, do practical things. Or sometimes I go to people's houses and we rearrange their whole bedroom or their kitchen to make it more conducive to them doing the task. It's the practical application in your day-to-day life where the OT comes in, but you still need, in some instances, to go for counseling or psychological to deal with the emotional aspects. You still need a doctor to address your physical health if you're looking at the person holistically.
And once again, it differs from person to person.
From person to person.
Your individual needs will determine if that multidisciplinary approach is necessary or not. And again, one final question on OT before we move on to your private practice growth club is, if you've been diagnosed as being ADHD and the necessary therapies are in place, including perhaps medication like Ritalin, it doesn't mean that you're going to be on that path for the rest of your life. It depends on your personality, your resilience, how determined you are to overcome this disorder, if that's the correct analogy that I'm using here, disorder, the correct term. That at some point in your life, you will then integrate very seamlessly in your normal circles. Would I be correct in saying that?
Yes, absolutely. So that is the reason why you don't, a lot of GPs are just, prescribing Concerta and Ritalin, etc., with no real experience or key knowledge of what ADHD actually is. You need to go to somebody who is an expert and is passionate about this and understands the changes and how medication works. And you can't just get a script and then you just take it for the rest of your life. This is the reason why you have to go for follow-ups. And you need to go to a doctor who's actually going to ask you, not just say, oh, how's the side effects, and okay, we'll give you another script. Somebody who actually takes interest in how are you functioning in your day-to-day life. It might be they need to increase your medication. Sometimes it might be they decrease it. Some people can wean themselves off. Each person is individual, but you need to go to a practitioner who takes a deep interest in your actual functioning in day-to-day life and not just whether you have side effects or not.
Okay, very quickly, in fact, it is the end of the show, so I think we're going to leave the Private Practice Growth Club for another time. I have invited you to come back. Thank you indeed for your valuable input on the show today regarding occupational therapy and ADHD. That's it from us right here on Perspective. This is fascinating. I hope you've enjoyed it. Till the next time, as always, Assalamu alaikum and Khuda Hafiz.